be here, but they're participating in other ways, and obviously they'll have access to this information, and they've already received some access to this information. So without further ado, we will we'll have a call to order. Take the roll call.
Representative Blanton.
Here.
Representative Fleming.
Here.
Representative Hatton. Representative Jenkins. Representative Riley.
Here.
Representative Sharp. Senator McGarvey.
Here.
Senator Nemes. Senator Schroeder. Senator Storm.
Here.
Senator Thomas. Senator Wise. Vice Chair Howell. Vice Chair Beckler.
Here.
Co-Chair Carroll.
Here.
And Co-Chair Nemes.
Here. We're going to go ahead and approve the minutes from December 16th, 2021. So do I have a motion for that?
We have
Okay. All right, we have a motion and a second. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All those opposed say nay. The minutes have been approved. Before we move on, we have a something somber to report, very sad. A young lady named Sarah Elizabeth Chastain from Jefferson County, 22 years old, was a graduate student, second-year graduate student at the University of Kentucky Martin School. Like I said, she grew up in Anchorage, and she worked for this committee as what was her actual role? As a graduate fellow. I didn't remember her exact title. As a graduate fellow, all the staff of this committee know her well, and she was the kind of person that had the brightest smile in the world. What a future she had in front of her, and she did a lot of really great things in the time that she had on this earth. She passed away about a little bit under a month ago, and so if everyone would join me, I'd like to have a moment of silence for Sarah Elizabeth Chastain, and before we move forward. Thank you. So we'll go right into our reports as we normally do. We have information from our staff, our very able staff who've looked into some things, and then I think a number of officials from the Administrative Office of the Courts will come in and present their what they want to present, and we'll take questions along the way. So with that, I don't know if Mr. Brown or Mr. Spears is going to start, but the mic is yours.
All right. Thank you, sir. At its November 13th, 2020 meeting, the Legislative Oversight and Investigations Committee voted to study the processes by which judicial contracts are awarded. This report reviews contracting policies and practices of the judicial branch. Staff reviewed requirements for procurement, including policies, training documents, and internal and external audits. Staff analyzed expenditures and contracts from fiscal year 2019 to fiscal year 2021, sampled contract files to compare against requirements, and reviewed audits of judicial systems from other states. The review of audits from other states did not produce a finding and is summarized in an appendix. The Kentucky Court of Justice is composed of the Supreme Court, Court of Appeals, Circuit Court, the clerks for the Circuit Court, and District Court. Supreme Court Rule 1.050 establishes AOC as the legal and fiscal arm of the KCOJ. Within AOC, the Office of Finance and Administration oversees contracting and purchasing for the judicial branch, which includes solicitations, negotiations, awards, and renewals. First, we're going to discuss Court of Justice overall expenditures and contract expenditures. This table shows total personnel, operating, and capital outlay expenditures from fiscal year 2019 to fiscal year 2021. The largest category of expenditures are for personnel, which include salaries and fringe benefits. Significant operating expenditures include rentals and leases, office supplies, and telephone charges. Significant capital outlay includes IT hardware and motor vehicles. This table shows the amount spent out of overall judicial expenditures on contracts from fiscal year 2019 through fiscal year 2021. Each of the rows in the table represents a different type of financial document in the statewide accounting system, with the amounts pulled from the accounting system. CTRP1s are for real property contracts. MAs are for master agreements, which set a price for goods or services for later purchases. PON 2 are proof of necessity agreements, which are for professional services. SCs are service contracts for non-professional goods and services. The allowable amount is the maximum amount that may be spent on a contract. The recorded amount is the sum of all payments made against the contract. AOC's contract spending as a whole does not approach the maximum, but individual contracts do reach the maximum. These amounts show AOC spent millions on various contracts, which demonstrates the importance of strong controls. Next, we'll discuss the requirements for contracts. Contracting requirements are established through internal policy documents and rules of administrative procedure, which are implemented by a Supreme Court. From fiscal year 2019 to fiscal year 2021, 3 internal documents guided procurement. Initial guidelines were established in 2018. A detailed narrative was in place for fiscal year 2019 and was supplanted in fiscal year 2021. AOC will implement a new policy for procurement in fiscal year 2023, which combines multiple procurement requirements into a single document. Procurement processes are divided between the procurement of goods and non-professional services and the procurement of professional services. Goods and non-professional services less than $10,000 require 1 quote, while those $10,000 or greater but less than $50,000 require 3 quotes. Purchases that are $50,000 or more require a request for bids. All professional services require a request for proposals. There are exceptions to the competitive process for purchases off a master agreement, governmental or nonprofit vendors, emergencies, sole source, or not feasible or practicable to bid. Requests for bids, which are for goods and non-professional services, start with a requester submitting a form that includes the scope of services and an estimated cost. The procurement officer works with the requester to develop award criteria, which must be either low bid or best value. An RFB form is entered into the statewide accounting system, and vendors associated with the type of purchase are notified. The procurement officer also sends an email to known vendors. Bidders are asked to mail or email bids, which are tabulated in a template. The low bid or best value bid are determined, and a notice is sent to the awardee and all bidders. Requests for proposals, which are for professional services, start with the requester filling out a form, which includes the statement of work and the estimated cost. The procurement officer then develops evaluation criteria. Example criteria include cost, experience, delivery timeline, and methodology. The officer also develops a cost proposal form and any other form required to be completed by the vendor. The RFP is entered into the statewide accounting system, then the system pushes a notification to all vendors associated with the type of service. The procurement officer also sends a generic email to known vendors. Vendors are asked to mail or email proposals. The procurement officer determines if offers are responsive and drafts rating sheets. An evaluation committee of 3 to 7 people review the responses. The evaluation committee completes rating sheets, which are used to select an offer. Real property leases are guided by Rules of Administrative Procedure, Part 10, Section 5 from 2006. Officials or managers request new or additional space in writing. If there is no suitable government-owned building, AOC issues a public notice where space is sought that provides requirements and where and when to send responses. Responses are opened at the same time, and AOC can negotiate with owners. AOC staff inspect each property that meets requirements and complete site evaluations. Owners are asked to submit a best and final offer, which are assessed by the Executive Officer of Court Facilities. The AOC director uses the assessment to select the best proposal. Applicants are told the lease has been awarded, and the property is inspected a final time to ensure required changes have been made. In 2019, AOC established a new policy that prohibits leasing of property from court-appointed or elected officials and employees or their family members. These individuals cannot have a 5% or greater ownership interest in a property.
We will now discuss our 3 finding areas, starting with how AOC satisfactorily addressed recommendations from the 2018 Auditor of Public Accounts examination. The 2018 examination reviewed AOC as a whole and had 16 recommendations related to procurement. AOC has addressed 15 of those recommendations, while one was partially implemented. The partially completed recommendation was to require purchase orders or request forms for all purchases made with a Pro Card. AOC stated these forms are not required because the Pro Card program is designed to give employees flexibility, and instead cited other internal controls, including the submission of receipts prior to payment, purchase limits, and limitations on vendor type. By using the APA recommendations, AOC has made steady progress towards an overhaul of its internal control framework. First, it developed multiple procurement policies and will implement a new policy in July 2022. It also updated its leasing policies in fiscal year 2019 to prohibit conflicts of interest. Second, it created an internal audit function and audit committee. The AP creating the function was made effective in October 2019. This function can serve as oversight of any AOC process and has already completed 11 audits. However, there are two areas related to APA recommendations where additional clarity could be beneficial. The first is the partially completed APA recommendation. AOC told APA that it would update its Pro Card agreement to require cardholders to obtain prior approval from their manager before making purchases. An internal audit found 23 transactions without approvals from the cardholder's appointing authority. The audit established AOC's intent for pre-approvals for certain buyers, but it is reasonable that all Pro Card users would seek pre-approval. AOC cited point-of-sale requirements as a control, but this does not prevent excessive or unnecessary purchases that fall within requirements. Additional controls could help improve the internal control framework. Additionally, the APA examination recommended the internal audit function or the internal audit committee be designated as the reporting entity for waste, fraud, and abuse. Committee staff found that new AP language outlines waste, fraud, and abuse as part of internal audit's work, but does not specifically state that internal audit is the reporting entity. Recommendation 3.1 is that AOC should consider implementing an additional preventative control to prevent cardholders from making excessive or unnecessary purchases. For example, approvals via emails or documented verbal approvals could be used to strengthen the overall internal control framework. Recommendation 3.2 is that AOC should consider amending AP Part 9, Section 3, C1 to formally state that internal audit is the designated reporting entity for allegations of waste, fraud, and abuse. The remaining finding areas and recommendations come directly from committee staff analysis. Our second finding area is that contract documents met many, but not all, requirements set by AOC. Committee staff requested a sample of 32 contract files for the most expensive procurements from fiscal year 2019 to fiscal year 2021. This was used to determine if AOC met its own documentation requirements for contracts. In general, documentation of competitively bid contracts was thorough and complete. Bid templates sent to vendors, individual bid files, criterion score sheets, and executed contracts were almost all complete and available. Additionally, documentation for real property leases showed almost no problems. However, other requirements were not met. The sample of 32 contracts found the following deviations from procurement requirements. 12 32 sampled contracts did not include the required request form to initiate the process. One RFP did not have the request form because it replaced another contract near its end date. Another RFP did not have the request form because it was requested verbally. 5 other samples had required information but used the wrong forms. Of the 32 sampled contracts, 10 contracts were exempt from the competitive process. 2 SCs did not have justification for their exception. 5 PON 2s had documentation for their competitive exceptions, but AOC did not have a written determination that they were appropriate exceptions. On one RFP disclosure of interest form, a reviewer indicated that they had a conflict of interest, but there was no description of the conflict. There was also no indication of action taken on the conflict. AOC stated that the reviewer had indicated a conflict of interest by mistake, but it should have been noticed by a reviewer. Another RFP did not have conflict of interest, statement of confidentiality, or communication disclosure forms, because they were lost when files were moved. Recommendation 3.3 is if AOC intends to allow RFPs to be initiated without a request form, exceptions should be entered into policy. Otherwise, request forms should be maintained for RFPs. Recommendation 3.4 is if AOC intends for RFPs to be initiated after the closing of a prior contract or through verbal request, those exceptions should be entered into policy. Otherwise, RFPs should be required to initiate a new contract following an expired contract or to document a verbal request. Recommendation 3.5 is that AOC should ensure correct forms are used for submitting contract information. Recommendation 3.6 is that AOC should establish stronger practices to meet documentation requirements in its own policies. Specifically, request forms should be maintained unless using a competitive exception or existing procurement vehicle. Competitive bidding exception documentation should be maintained from the time of the request. Recommendation 3.7 is that AOC should ensure all files are digitized in a timely manner to avoid losing files. Recommendation 3.8 is if a selection committee member indicates there is a conflict of interest, AOC staff should ensure the conflict is documented and should also document whether the committee member was allowed to serve.
Our final finding area is that AOC used general accounting expenditures for unsuitable payments. AOC spent millions of dollars per year through general accounting expenditures, or GATSs, on categories that were not meant to be paid through these documents. Based on finance and administration cabinet training material, these financial documents are meant to pay reimbursements, utilities, postage, and agency-specific authorities. An over-reliance on these documents can weaken internal controls, which we will discuss later. This table shows the top 5 categories of GATSs from fiscal year 2019 to fiscal year 2021 after removing appropriate uses. This table represents about 77% of these documents. The category for other professional services collects services like technical support and team court coordinators. The other category collects payments to Kroger, drug court testing services, and lab fees. There was not enough detail to determine what was purchased through the IT software and capital outlay categories. The last category collects 50 additional categories where these documents were used. While the table as a whole would typically use a payment document called Payment Request Commodity, or PRC, the last category includes some areas that are clearly suitable for PRCs, like motor vehicles, architectural and engineering services, and furniture, fixture, or equipment over $5,000. Current AOC policy permits the use of GATSs to pay purchase orders under $50,000 or purchases from master agreements. Allowing additional uses of these documents creates control weaknesses. They make tracking contract spending and individual purchases more difficult. They do not post against contracts and will not increase the amount on contracts. They also do not work with an accounting feature that allows users to find any payments made from a contract. These documents have fewer places to enter in purchase information. There are 443 payments whose descriptions were only purchase order and inventory numbers. By comparison, PRCs have areas to describe the purchase and enter commodity numbers, quantities, units, prices, service dates, and invoice numbers. GATSs may also allow an agency to overspend on contracts. If they are used against a contract with a spending limit, the payment will not post against the limit, and the agency can continue paying even after exceeding the limit. AOC officials have stated it is looking for ways to eliminate general accounting expenditures outside of their intended purposes. Requirements for the documents will change in the 2023 procurement policy. Recommendation 3.9 is AOC should move forward with minimizing the use of GATSs outside of telephone, internet, utility, and mail services. Based on the proposed fiscal year 2023 policy, AOC intends to use these documents for invoices approved by the Finance and Administration Director. This allows for additional uses of these documents and may burden the Director. Recommendation 3.10 is to prevent increased GATS use. AOC should create criteria or general categories for invoices that may be approved by the Director of the Office of Finance and Administration for payment by GATSs. After implementing the fiscal year 2023 policy, the Finance and Administration Director may still find circumstances where a standalone payment is necessary. When this happens, AOC should strive to use a more appropriate PRC. If GATSs are needed, the document should indicate its purpose and have clear director approval. So, recommendation 3.11 is if standalone payments are still needed after implementing the fiscal year 2023 procurement policy, AOC officials should determine if they can be replaced by standalone PRCs so that GATSs are typically used for intended purposes. Recommendation 3.12 is if standalone GATSs are needed for an Office of Finance and Administration Director approved invoice, then the GATS description field should clearly indicate the purpose of the GATS. If possible, director approval should be maintained in records. Recommendation 3.13 is AOC should review its GATSs for the past 3 years to identify areas where award documents can be established in the future. For example, a review of GATSs to identify repeated payments to certain vendors for professional services and commodities could be used to consider whether using award documents could provide better competition and cost efficiencies. Also, using the Finance and Administration Cabinet's list of all state master agreements to identify appropriate awards could eliminate the time needed to research companies and receive quotes. In summary, AOC has made major improvements in its internal controls since 2018, particularly in its procurement policies and its internal audit function. However, there is still room for AOC to improve pre-approvals for pro cards and define responsibilities for waste, fraud, and abuse. Based on a sample of contracts, AOC is meeting requirements in some areas, like maintaining documentation of bids. AOC can improve its handling of other contract areas, like maintaining request forms and competitive exceptions. AOC also extensively used GATSs on expenditures that are not suited for the document type. Continuing to use these in the same way could lead to difficulty in tracking expenditures and spending. Fortunately, AOC officials have stated it will seek ways to improve contract document management and payments. This concludes our presentation. We will now take questions.
Thank you. I have several questions, and then I guess we'll call up Miss Lafferty and her and the people that are with her today. And if you want to be on the docket, obviously you know what to do. So the on let's see, it's slide. I guess it's slide 6. The expenditures by contract types in millions of dollars.
Yes.
The allowable number, as you identified, is more than the number that was actually recorded.
Yes.
Some of that may be that some information that should have went into allowable was expensed under the Gax. I suppose some of that.
I mean, it's possible.
But we're talking about that there's significant differences here. In 2021, there was allowable of $25.3 million, and the expenditures was $5.1 million. And so, what's an explanation for that? Is there? Let me ask this first.
Okay.
Was the $25.3 million appropriated?
That money has been appropriated to them. It's not specifically appropriated to those categories. They have that money, but there's not going to be anything in appropriation that says, as far as I'm aware, $3.6 million went to CTRP ones.
Right. It's in their base.
It's in their base amount.
Right.
Yeah.
But they were appropriated that amount of money, and then they recorded. They may have spent a little more on other ways that wasn't put in this proper category, and I'll ask that in a little bit. But if they were appropriated $25.3 million for this and received $5.1 million, where's the rest of the money going?
So, I mean, the money is not necessarily going. It is being spent on other areas. Those allowable amounts are not really good representations of what they expect to spend on the contracts. We've talked this through with them. The big one that stands out to us is that for service contracts, they put down $100,000 for interpreters. As far as I'm aware, they're never intending to spend that much for interpreters. They just put that on there to have an upper limit on what to spend. They usually spend like $4,000 or $5,000 on interpreters. So
on language interpreters?
Yeah.
You mean system-wide for a year?
Not system-wide, on
Okay.
individual contracts per interpreter. So for a specific interpreter, you would typically see an allowable amount of $100,000, but the ones we looked at, the actual amount spent tend to be like $4,000 or $5,000. The amount never approaches the total amount on those.
Okay.
So it's not. that money is being spent in other areas. They're not necessarily dedicating the full amount of the allowable amount to those contracts. If
Okay.
that makes sense.
On slide 5, we note that the operating costs, I'm looking at operating capital outlay. The cost, let's just look at operating right now. 145 million in 19, 147 million in change in 20, and 141 million in 21. Why the pretty significant reduction in cost there? Is that related to COVID? Do we know? That probably wasn't the purpose of your review. That just flagged to me that it's down $6 million from 20.
Yeah, I printed out some numbers. I'm looking very quickly to see if I can tell. This may end up being something you may be better off asking AOC staff. I'm not sure they prepared for that question.
Yep.
I'm seeing the numbers, but I'm not seeing an obvious. You see something wrong?
A lot of my questions are along this line. I think maybe from my perspective, I'll let them. We're gonna ask another question from Representative Fleming. Then I'll let them testify. And I want both of you guys at the table to help answer. Representative Fleming.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate going through. This is not a wonderful, sexy process to go through, and I respect that because I've gone through the same process when I was on Metro Council, and we went through and helped out the contracting folks on purchasing and so forth. And my questions are more along where what I'm familiar with, and looking at there's several categories you can procure a particular service or contract. Under the goods and non-professional, could you how do they define best value?
I'll make a comment, and you may want to ask them as well to get their thoughts on it. Usually best value, and this is, I've more talked to the finance people about what the general accepted definition of best value is. I didn't really talk to them about it. Usually in procurement, best value is what tends to be the lowest amount, but what also provides. Best value typically in procurement gives them some flexibility to say, yes, this person provided a lowest amount, but we feel better going to someone else. It's different from low bid, where low bid is always the lowest amount. Best value is amongst those who bid, who had low bids, we think that it's the best offer. It's a very nebulous definition.
Did you find any indication of them going through a systematic approach when it comes to weighting particular procurements based on professionalism and experience and those sorts of things? Because when you went through the things on the procuring for the RFP for services, I didn't hear anything about that. It might be there. I didn't know.
Yeah, generally, for the files that we requested, we were able to see how bids were scored and how score sheets were made. Generally, there were maybe 3 or 4 categories for any given bid, and that could have been from timeline to professionalism to presentation, and they were just scored and weighted. So it really depended on the individual bid that they were looking at.
Do you have, or they provide any matrix in terms of the volume going through each one of those procurement processes, as well as what's being contracted out?
Matrix.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah. There are several different ways you can procure, correct?
Yeah.
And so, have they gone through and where I'm going with this is that I want to make sure that their lines of decision, like $50,000, we found on Metro Council that was too low. And they were finding themselves not being efficient, not being productive, and so we through the procurement process, through an ordinance process, we changed that level up to 100,000. It made them more efficient and got things through the system more, and so they can procure things and have service and goods coming in quicker. That's where I'm going with this. So that's what I'm trying to see. Do they feel comfortable? Do you think it's efficient going through those different procurement processes based on the volume?
I feel like we didn't really look into that so much. We just looked into for a sample of contracts where the immediate requirements they set up. That is a good question. I don't exactly have, for instance, how many contracts were going through each process. I would ask them that. I know they've been revising their policies a lot, so they have been thinking about how their policies and what goes through each process.
Okay. Well, now just one more question, Mr. Chairman. I would encourage it to see if you could follow up on them and just have them go through it, explain that, because it's good. In your conclusion, it sounds good. They've made a lot of significant process in doing that. I just want to make sure they're as efficient as possible to get these things in and out, but yet I don't want to lose the sight of having a quality-based selection particularly when it comes to services and so forth. Thanks.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
If ALC could follow up on that and give that to the committee, and I think Ms. Lafferty may comment on that. Representative Blanton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Two questions very quickly. On Chapter 3, talking about the Gax documents, you're talking about it's being used to cover things it's not intended to, which could lead, because of the tracking, to overspending on maybe even contracts. Was that a widespread thing that we seen, or was that something more just happened to catch that it was being done?
No, it's not widespread. I mean, from the contracts we've looked at, it's not necessarily. I didn't see any evidence that they are actively overspending. It's not something we focused on. This is more of a general issue of GATSs in general. At the time we talked to them about this project, they were using GATSs for a lot of payments. Our concerns was that they would continue to use these on a lot of contracts to the point where it would become an issue. My understanding is the number of GATSs coming off contracts is relatively small. From what they've told me, a lot of these come off purchase orders, which is a little bit different. This is more of a we're just making sure this doesn't become an issue in the future.
Okay. And question number 2 is being specific to ALC, but it's intended more broadly. A question I'd like to ask to all of our government cabinets throughout is, in the weeks or last couple months leading up to the end of a fiscal year, I don't know if you all looked at this or it caught your eye. Did we see any gains or excess spending right there at the end before a budget cycle ended?
Do you remember seeing anything about that?
I don't remember seeing
That stood out.
related. Yeah, that stood out. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, we can see how they spend money throughout the year, but it's not something we actively looked at for this analysis.
So I asked that question for a reason, and it's not specifically AOC, but from my experience in government over 3 decades, has been that we as a government have a tendency that if any of our cabinets has monies left over from their budgets at the end of we want to punish them, and we got to get away from that punishment and encourage saving, because what happens is we have government offices that will go out and buy things just to spend it, not necessarily needing it, and that's a waste. I would rather they hold on to it and save it over into the next budget, and let's not punish them for doing a good job, because what their fear is that, well, we didn't use it all, so we're not going to get as much in our next budget. They're going to punish us. We got to get away from that mentality. And this has been going on for decades, and I think it benefits the taxpayers, and I think it will benefit our cabinets if we will be better at helping them say, yeah, hold on to this, spend it wisely. We're not going to punish you at the end of a budget cycle when you've got monies left over, but we're going to reward you for being good stewards of the money instead. And again, that's not pointed at AOC. That just happens across government from my experience, and I was just wondering if you saw that spike right towards the end.
All right.
We didn't.
Go ahead.
We didn't notice anything specifically related to that in the scope of our study.
Appreciate that. Ms. Lafferty, if you could come up. I would note, while you're doing the transition here, that as a former director of ALC and former legislator that was in charge of the judicial budget, they do have an anti-lapsing provision in the judicial budget. So if the money's not spent, it no longer lapses back to the general fund. And I remember when I was the director of ALC, we had a substantial amount of money at one point at the end of the year, and we didn't have that anti-lapsing portion. So what we did was we knew we needed a lot of upgrades and computers, and so we spent it all on that. I think that was an adequate thing. But the point, I think, is well taken, that the money is spent so it doesn't lapse. But there is now a provision in the judicial branch budget that has an anti-lapse, so it doesn't go back to the general fund if it's not spent. That's out of respect for the Chief Justice. Ms. Lafferty, you have the floor.
Well, good afternoon. I'll introduce myself. My name is Jenny Lafferty. I'm Director of Finance and Administration for the AOC. And I have with me today Tammy Brown, who is our Executive Officer of Financial Services, and Alice Wilson, who is our Director of Audits. So we're here today to talk to you about a project that we're really quite excited about, which is our implementation of the APA recommendations and our new procurement policy. So we'll start by talking about some of the actions that we've taken since the report of the APA. We engaged Deloitte to assist with implementation of our response to the audit. Deloitte made recommendations to us concerning internal controls, including automated controls and automated systems, and developed 6 process narratives and workflows. We underwent a reorganization of the AOC. We established the Office of Finance Administration, hiring a Director of Finance Administration, established the Office of Audits, hiring a Director of Audits, hired an AOC Policy Officer, and established an AOC Policy Unit, hired an Executive Officer of the Department of Financial Services, and established and staffed a Division of Procurement. We've developed an independent internal audit function. We retained Dean Dorton to assist with establishing this internal audit function and conduct several internal audits and the audit plans for the first 2 years of our internal audit function. We established the Division of Internal Audit and hired staff. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's right there. It's that one. There we go.
Hey,
Much better.
look at that. Fantastic. All right, there we go. And we established the Division of Internal Audit and hired staff and established the Audit Oversight Committee, which is chaired by the Chief Justice. And in the 2 years since we've had the Division of Internal Audit, they have performed 11 internal audits. The Supreme Court has adopted and revised several administrative procedures. They have revised AP Part 7, reimbursement for official travel. They've adopted AP Part 19 and revised it, which is the APs for internal and external audits of the AOC. And they've revised AP Part 3, personnel policies, adding ethics provisions. They've also entered an administrative order on surplus property. The judicial branch AOC no longer sells surplus property. We've adopted new AOC policies, policy for policy development, the reimbursement for job-related certifications, licenses, and memberships, cash handling, conflict of interest, and leasing. And we've adopted credit card program policies and procedures for pro cards and for credit cards. We've also developed auditable financial statements, which are available on our website. For fiscal year 2021, those were audited by MCM CPAs and advisors, and fiscal year 2022 should be available to be published in October. We've also leveraged available technology to add additional internal controls. We are using SharePoint to house all of our policies, as well as training. We have a document management system called OnBase that we use to establish electronic forms and associated workflows. And we're trying to leverage EMARS to its fullest extent in order to maintain better accountability and transparency. We've made several improvements to property accountability. All of our fixed asset information is currently maintained in a single system, which is Archibus. We're working to update our sublocation codes in EMARS. We're updating insurance certificates with state risk. And we conducted a physical inventory of all over $300 fixed assets, which was completed earlier this year. We also, in the Office of Finance and Administration, have been busy working on standard operating procedures and forms. So we currently have 189 standard operating procedures, either complete or in development, as well as 156 standard forms and 37 contract templates. The first finding of committee staff was that the Auditor of Public Accounts recommendations have been implemented. And we agree with that, and we also agree with the recommendations made by the committee, and we will implement the 2 recommendations made by the committee. We will incorporate, with reference to the ProCard recommendation, we're going to incorporate a statement in our OnBase form, which is a workflow. It's an electronic workflow. Anytime that an expenditure is made with ProCard, it has to be entered into this workflow and approved by management after the expenditure is made. and then it goes on to accounting to be paid. And anyone who has a Pro card has signed an agreement stating that if it's not approved or if the purchase was not in compliance with procurement policies, that they will pay the bill instead of having the AOC pay the bill. So what we're going to do is we're going to implement a statement in that on-base workflow for all expenditures over $500 that there was prior verbal approval from the management, so that manager is signing off on that when it goes through that workflow. And this will help us maintain some flexibility, because that's the purpose of Pro cards, is to have some flexibility to be able to make expenditures. For example, we have service staff that go out throughout the state and service security systems. And when they're out servicing security systems, we do have contracts, and we purchase from existing contracts for security equipment. But if they get out there and they're several counties away and they're working on a system and they notice that there's something that they need to purchase, they need to have the flexibility to go out to the local Lowe's, the local Walmart, and make a purchase so that they can complete the installation. And we will recommend that the Supreme Court more formally designate the Internal Audit Division as the judicial branch's reporting entity for fraud, waste, and abuse in AP Part 19. And right now, they are actually the reporting entity for fraud, waste, and abuse. It just doesn't specifically state that, so we'll go back into the policy and specifically state it. With respect to finding 2, contract documents met many but not all requirements. We again agree with those findings. The one thing we would like to note is that the most common finding was that there were no request forms that were retained with the procurements. And while there were not request forms, I think probably the most concerning thing about that is that there might not be approvals from management, or there might not be approvals from budget directors or the budget's office for the expenditures. But for every contract where there wasn't an approval form, we did have a contract that was signed by management and also signed by the budget director. So they were actually approving those expenses. It just wasn't kept with the request form at the beginning of the process. So what we are doing is we are leveraging OnBase. So this is the biggest OnBase project that the AOC has had. We're implementing a procurement workflow through OnBase. So all requisitions are going to have to be submitted into that OnBase workflow. And until all of the required documentation is submitted, it forces you to put all the required information in. It can't be submitted to procurement to make a purchase until all the required information has been submitted. And then it routes it through a workflow that takes it through management and takes it through the budget office before it ever gets to procurement. So all that will be documented and maintained in that OnBase e-requisition system. And we're also going to be documenting the competitive exceptions in that e-requisition system as well. So after it goes through to procurement, if they're purchasing it based on a competitive exception, it has to go out to management to approve that.
What does a competitive exception mean?
Competitive exceptions are emergency exceptions under the statute, which is when there's fire, flood, tornado, something like that. A sole source, when there's only one entity that can provide the service or provide the product, or when it's not feasible or practicable to bid. And the executive branch has a list of about 15 situations when it's not feasible or not practicable to bid, and we've adopted all those and pulled them over into our policy.
Okay, not exactly the same, but along the similar line of, and also following what Representative Fleming asked, are there any specific reporting or any specific findings when you go away from the lowest price because you needed to do that because the lowest price wasn't the best bid?
So it sounds to me like you're asking about when we're issuing a solicitation, an RFP.
Well, when you grant the award.
Right, and we're granting an award, and it's based on best value instead of low bid.
Right.
And since I have been in this position, which was in 2008, we've not issued an RFP on a low bid or on a best value basis. We've only done it on a low bid basis. So when we issue an RFP, we're doing that based on criteria that is subjective criteria. But every time we've issued an RFP for goods, it's been based on a low bid basis.
It's been low bid. Would you, you said you haven't done that before, but could we go ahead and put something in policy that says if you need to go away from the lowest bid because the best value is different,
Yep.
that we make a specific notation of the reason why something overcomes the low value?
Yeah, that is actually in our policy. And
Okay.
actually, we have a much stricter view of what a best value bid would be than what Mr. Spears was explaining. So for us, a best value interpretation would have to be something that's communicated into the bid. in the RFP. We would have to tell them we're going to grade you based on this, this, and this. So if it's a best value, it's not something that's subjective that we're seeing on the back end when we get the responses in. And it has to be something that is objective, not subjective. So, for example, it would be, what is your timeline for furnishing the product that we've ordered? 2 weeks, 3 weeks. It would have to be something that is objective, or otherwise it's not a best value criteria for us.
Thank you.
Finding number 3 was about the Gax payments, which has been something that we have been working on for a while. So AOC has never issued purchase orders or delivery orders through the EMARS system. We have our own separate in-house purchase order database that was created by ITS years and years and years ago. And we issue all of our purchase orders through this purchase order database. And all of the information that Mr. Spears was talking about that is included in those PRC documents, if we were to pay with a PRC document that's missing in the Gax documents, that's all included in our PO database. But it's not available in EMARS. So it's not available when someone from Finance Administration Cabinet wants to look or someone from LRC wants to look. So we think it's really important for us to be accountable. We think it's important for us to, have information in EMARS that everybody can see. And we think it's important for us to follow the same, guidelines in EMARS that, other branches are following. So we do want to comply with that, comply with recommendations, and we're looking for ways to do it. And so what we've done in our new policy is we've stated that Gax documents can only be used for utilities, telephone, internet, reimbursements, and that's all. There are no exceptions. We were going to have some exceptions, or we thought we might need some exceptions, but we've been working with the Controller's Office and OPS to try to identify how else we'll be able to make some payments against these purchase orders that are not in the system, and we are going to be able to use standalone PRC documents, which I think is going to provide a better accounting tool for us. So for the next fiscal year, we're going to use standalone PRC documents to make payments against our purchase orders that are in our own separate purchase order system, while we work toward learning how to issue our purchase orders in the EMARS system, and we're going to start issuing POs and DOs in the EMARS system within the next year. We are working on making continuous improvements throughout the Office of Finance Administration. We have been training employees on new policies, procedures, and in EMARS. We've had multiple EMARS trainings over the last few months, and we just started training our accounting employees on our new procurement policy this week, and procurement employees are going to be trained next week. We're seeking opportunities to leverage EMARS. We're using standalone PRCs to pay POs and DOs instead of Gax documents. Updating cited authorities list in EMARS to include cited authorities applicable to the judicial branch, which has been one of our challenges. When we enter a PO in EMARS, there is no cited authority that's applicable to us right now. We're just having to use a general, judicial branch budget bill cited authority. So we'd like to build out the cited authorities list so that we actually can track what the authority is for us to issue each type of document we're issuing. And we'll begin creating POs and DOs in EMARS beginning in fiscal year 2023. We're seeking additional opportunities to leverage OnBase. We're going to have an invoice workflow, a contract development and routing workflow, and potentially even a travel workflow. And we have multiple AOC policies under development, including a telework policy right now. We also have several updates that we would like to recommend to the Supreme Court for administrative procedures, including judicial branch grants, procurement, accounting, capital construction, operation and maintenance, court facilities, leasing, and security. And we've been working in the Department of Procurement to improve our vendor management and contract evaluation and administration. This has been a huge undertaking for these folks in the Office of Finance Administration. We've had a lot of changes since 2018. And so it couldn't be done without all of the management that's listed on this page. And I just can't thank them enough for their willingness to make changes. It's been a humbling experience, but they've all been very willing. So I'm just pleased to work with this group of people and wanted you all to know that. And if you have any questions, we'll be happy to take them.
I would like to ask Mr. Spears to come back up and sit with you. And then we're going to start with Senator Carroll, Chairman Carroll, and then we'll go to the next question. Senator?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I guess I kind of have a question in general, and you all may not be able to answer this, but matter of fact, we're doing our budget for the organization that I run right now. So, I know what a headache it is tracking expenses and being consistent, and I get all that. I guess I'm a little surprised that I guess I assume through state government that all the practices were standard throughout every cabinet, and we were all supposed to do it the same. And the fact that you all are doing individual policies for AOC, I guess that surprises me a little bit. And Jerry, that might be something that you can address from your background. Is that do cabinets and programs within cabinets have the ability to have unique policies in relation to procurement and budgeting and expenditures and that type of thing?
Mr. Chairman, basically with the executive branch agency, those policies and guidance comes from the finance cabinet and the controller's office, and so they are expected to pretty much follow suit with that guidance. But if you're looking at different branches of government, like the legislative branch and the judicial branch, they may vary differently from those policies and guidance because they are a separate branch of government.
So the AOC not being on EMARS, how is that possible? I thought everyone had to use that particular program.
So we do have to use EMARS because it rolls up into the annual financial reports. But we have not had to use it in the same way as the executive branch.
Jenny, get closer to the mic.
Have not had to use it in the same way as the executive branch, and in fact have not had the training or even been included on a lot of the email updates that may go out about EMARS because we're in a different branch of government. So we are working to try to have a better information line with OPS and the controller's office so that we can establish processes that I think are more in line with what the executive branch is doing, because I think it's going to make it easier for our partners, like the legislature, to see what we're doing and know that we're handling things in a way that's transparent and accountable.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, if I might just follow up. In looking with the initial presentation, I mean, obviously there's a lot of structure built in, but there also seemed to be a lot of flexibility built in to bypass the policies that were in place. If expenditures went over, where you could make expenditures from other categories. Do you all feel comfortable with the changes you're making, that not only will dollars be accounted for, but as the chairman said, reasons for what happened being documented? I know when I do a budget, we document every year when we budget money in the notes. This is what we're doing. This is our plan. And, if it doesn't work out, then in the next budget, we document what happened. So the numbers are great, but if you don't document reasons in more detail, it all loses meaning, and it can be very subjective at that point if you don't explain why you did what you did. Do you all feel pretty comfortable that in the future that everything will be accounted for both numerically and within documentation and explanation?
So I would say I feel confident with accounting for what we're doing right now, but I feel more confident with what we're doing in the future. So let me explain. And I think you're talking about the actual versus what would have been allowed versus the actual expenses.
Well, if you do a contract and you have a contract and it exceeds what it was supposed to, the fact that if you pulled money from somewhere else, that is documented, or there's a reason, or
right.
It's all tracked.
And we're not pulling money from somewhere else now, to the best of my knowledge.
Okay.
I can't swear that has never happened, but to the best of my knowledge, that's not something that happens on a regular basis.
Okay.
But going back to, I think, Representative Nemes's question about the interpreter contracts and why there's such a variation between what was authorized and what was actually spent and where that money was going. It goes back to the contract types that we were entering in EMARS, because the judicial branch has sort of viewed EMARS as a mechanism to get somebody paid. We haven't really viewed it as a full accounting system. Our accounting system has been a little bit more manual than that. So what we were doing is we have a budget for how much we're going to pay court interpreters, and we know what our annual budget is. But the court interpreter contracts, probably if we were doing it under the policy as it will be starting July 1st, court interpreter contracts should have been inserted into EMARS as master agreements instead of SC documents. But we were entering them as SC documents, which requires you to give a maximum amount of the contract. So we were always inserting something ridiculously high because you never know which interpreter you're going to use. So we were inserting something ridiculously high on every contract, so we never hit the maximum. And, the budgeted number is the budgeted number. We're going to spend about what we spent last year. That's how we figure up our budget. But the contract amounts would exceed what the budgeted number was, just because we never knew which contract to apply the funds to. And going forward, in master agreements, there isn't a maximum for those, and so that's how we're going to enter them going forward. But it goes back to we just haven't been entering them into the EMARS system, probably in the best way that allows us to account properly.
Thank you. And that leads, I know one of the things we're talking about is going to a zero-based budgeting in various cabinets, and it's maybe that would answer that question. And so the reason you guys put a large number is because that wasn't the reason you were using that system. That it was a field you had to fill out, but
Correct.
It didn't have anything to do with the oversight or the auditing. Okay, all right. But the new system is not going to have that little quirk there.
Correct.
So on slide number 5, when we talk about the number of dollars that have gone down quite substantially, $6 million from FY20 to 21 in operating, almost down. So do you know what that is? That may be a question better for Ms. Henderson.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a question we'll have to ask our budget office, but we can get back to you on that.
Okay, and I think you've answered my question on slide number 6. For example, the allowable for FY21 was 25.3 million and the use was 5.1. That to you doesn't mean much because you weren't using it for that purpose. Now, you said with respect to interpreter services, but is that also true with other contracts?
It's not. It might be true on a case-by-case basis, but by and large, it's the interpreter contracts that I think that made the majority of the difference. We have a number of interpreter contracts, and probably 100 or maybe more interpreter contracts, and they were all being put at a very large amount. And I don't know of any other category of contracts that we were inserting as SC contracts that probably should have been a master agreement.
On slide 12, we talk about the conflict of interest, the change made to real property leases. Obviously, the purpose of that, the catalyst of that was what happened with Justice Wright's contract for his office in Letcher County, and I'll get to that in a minute. But it says no employee or family member. I know that he tried to get a contract with AOC that was stopped, and then the next day his son contracted with AOC. But does that also include an employee or family member ownership interest in an LLC or another company?
It does, and we have our vendors fill out a disclosure of ownership so that we know everybody that has an interest in the company.
Is that 5% above?
Yeah, that's where we. Thank you. That's where we have that 5% or more interest. It includes everybody with 5% or more interest.
3 requested files. This is from slide 22. 3 requested files from AOC were requested that were not. They were lost. And are they not electronically housed as well?
So our contracts are electronically housed. All of our documentation for our solicitations and our contract requests are not electronically housed right now. Once we get e-requisition in place, they will be electronically housed. And one file in particular was lost when we physically moved the files from department to department.
Hold on just a second. He's leaving. And then I think that's all the questions I have. I do have, I have one more question. That is, and I'm a lawyer, so when I say one more question, don't hold me to it. The judges laugh when lawyers say, "You got one more question, Your Honor." I think you said, Mr. Spears, that there was one area that they disagreed with or didn't have comments on or didn't make progress toward. Help me understand what you said, because I don't know exactly what you said. And what is that one area and why?
For our recommendations, they did not say that. You may be thinking of the APA recommendations, where there was an APA recommendation that they have purchase orders or request forms every time someone buys something off a Pro card. They said they didn't want to do that to preserve flexibility. We're not recommending they do that either. We just wanted them to have some type of relatively informal communication with their manager so that someone there is aware that they are making purchases on the Pro Card. For our recommendations, they agreed with all of them, and they gave very good feedback on how they felt about those.
You agree with that, Ms. Lafferty?
Yes.
Okay. No other questions. I do want to note. I want to commend the Chief Justice, Director Givens, and the AOC. I want to remind everyone the reason we're here, and that is because Auditor Mike Harmon did an audit of the AOC's expenditures, credit card usages, leasing practices, and it was, in my view, the biggest black mark on the court system in my memory. I've been a lawyer for nearly 20 years. It was a tremendously good audit that was done, and I want to commend the Chief Justice because he met that audit not with any kind of defensive posture, not with any kind of but or pointing fingers. He went to work immediately on fixing those problems, and we are here today. And I would note that our staff made a finding, which they've reported today, that there have been major internal control improvements since 2018. And so I wanted to put that on the record that that while we have more improvements to be had, we always will. That significant problem that we had that was unearthed by Mike Harmon has been seriously addressed, and I wanted to thank you and AOC, especially Director Givens, for the work that you guys have done. With no further questions, I think we're going to rest at ease for a moment because I think we've lost quorum by one person, and we need to approve the report. Yes, sir. Senator Carroll.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We spoke earlier about the budget funds and whatever is left over, that it remains within AOC. How do you all track that, and what can that be used for? Is it part of the following year budget where it's integrated into that, or how is that tracked?
I'm asking Tammy if she wants to take it because she was in our budget department for a while.
I did, but I didn't have extensive knowledge of that.
That may be something that we're going to have to get back with you about
Do
from the budget
you have any
office.
idea of how much that usually is on average? I know it's different every year.
Without looking at our financial statements, I don't.
Okay. Please, I'm just curious. It's not reverting back to the general fund. How we track it, because I don't guess I've ever heard in any budget request that we've got all this money left over from the previous year. That's probably not information they would want the legislature to know when budgeting.
Well, we do report it. I know it goes in through KBUD. If we do have anything that's left over, it does get reported to the legislature. But I also know that Carol would probably tell us that the judicial branch has been structurally imbalanced for a number of years. So I'm not sure that there's really a lot that gets carried forward.
Well, I appreciate you all's work, and I don't want any of you all thinking that we're questioning what you all do, because quality people within that branch of government, and I have the utmost faith in them, and it's just we can always do better through our processes, and I compliment you all for your efforts and staff for the work they've done through this report and in their review, and the auditor.
And I'm told that we don't have any excess in appropriations, that we only ever have excess in restricted funds.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We're going to take a 5-minute and try to make sure that we have a quorum so we can go ahead and approve this. But my last question is this. You read the audit from Mike Harmon a number of years ago. Do you feel like all of those issues, employees buying property, blah, 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 all the stuff that was in there, and people can go back and reference that, are all those things covered by what the new policies are? Are there other things that we need to assist the AOC in doing to make sure that those things don't recur?
I would say 100% of it is covered, and then some.
Okay, thank you. All right, we're not going to take a 5-minute. We're going to go ahead and I'm going to take a motion to approve the report.
So moved.
Is there a second? There's been a motion and a second, and we need to do a roll call to make that official. I've made that mistake before, and my good friends over here looking at me very closely said, don't do it again. So we're going to call roll.
Representative Blanton.
Aye.
Representative Fleming. Representative Hatton. Representative Jenkins. Representative Riley. Representative Sharp. Senator McGarvey. Senator Nemes. Senator Schroeder. Senator Storm,
Aye.
Senator Thomas, Senator Wise, Vice Chair Howell, Vice Chair Beckler,
Aye.
Co-Chair Carroll,
Aye.
and Co-Chair Nemus.
Yes. All right, so we have approved the report, and I don't think we have any further business at this time, and so we're adjourned. Thank you.